about anti-capitalism and the crisis. We've got Jonny James come up from London. He's the assistant editor of International Socialism Journal, and his talk about this is actually in the journal. So we're going to read that if you're really interested by what he says. So he's going to talk for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion. And go, Jonny.
And for all those people who might be watching on screen, I'm well aware of the irony of doing a talk on anti-capitalism in what is now the biggest fast food chain in the world, and according to Wikipedia when I was looking at it earlier. Yeah, I want to start with a couple of things the Tories have said recently. There was a big campaign a few months ago against the government's workfare programme, trying to get people to work for nothing. In February, Chris Grayling, who's the Tory Employment Minister, launched this attack on the SWP, saying that we're part of a broader anti-capitalist trend in our society. Campaign groups are waging war very deliberately against big business. Just a few days after that, Boris Johnson wrote in the Telegraph talking about the corporations who had pulled out of the scheme after the protests. He said they don't want to be thought of as top-hatted slave drivers. They know that a spirit of anti-capitalism stalks the land, a fire-breathing beast that has shriveled Stephen Hester's bonus in its nostril blast and scorched Fred Goodwin's knighthood and now seeks whomever else it may devour. They have seen what happened to the St. Paul's clergy who got in the way of the Occupy movement, and they don't want to be the next in line. Sounds pretty cool to me. Perhaps we need a slightly more balanced look at what's going on. But I mean, the fact that this is being said is quite interesting, because actually over the past 18 months we have seen quite a transformation in the politics that I guess could be described as anti-capitalist around the world. We've seen the revolutions in the Arab world, the Indignados movement in Spain, similar protests in Greece that have intensified and intensified. Of course, you've also had in Britain the student revolt and the rise of Occupy Wall Street and the global explosion of occupations that followed it. And really what you've seen, I think, are battle lines that have been drawn in the popular consciousness of millions of people between, on the one hand, the 1% of the population who have all the benefits of economic growth, control the wealth, own the politicians, and on the other hand, everybody else, the 99%. And some people have talked about the 15th of October as the rebirth of the anti-capitalist movement that we saw emerge after the Battle of Seattle in 1999. But I think that while there are similarities to that movement, there are also quite sharp differences. Seamus Milne in The Guardian pointed to what these differences are when he said that these occupations echo both the spirit and organisation of the movement after 1999, but it's the drama in Tahrir Square that has given it such evocative power. And while the 90s protest took place at a time of boom, today's occupations are targeting a global capitalism in the deepest crisis. So really, with the emergence of the new movements against capitalism, they're happening in quite a different context. One in which revolution has returned to the stage of history, and also in the midst of a crisis that has shown up capitalism not just to be a nasty system, as people thought after the Battle of Seattle, but also an inherently unstable system. And I think that the other thing that we should bear in mind is that we can't just limit the anti-capitalism to occupations and camps, because in a way you can think about how this idea of the 99% really touches on a lot of the mobilizations, a lot of the campaigns that we've been involved in. If people have been on the demonstrations on the 30th of November, for example, very much I felt that on those demonstrations when you had 2.5 million people on strike, that idea of us and them that had really been sharply polarized around the idea of the 99% and the 1%. And I think this is quite important because it marks in a lot of ways, a very important step forward in terms of class consciousness. And this is particularly key in America, where the idea of the 99% versus the 1% undercuts a sense of nationalism that has constantly been evoked in the politics over there. Paul LeBlanc, the American revolutionary, says that the Occupy movement, in its opposition of the 99% to the 1%, creates in highly popularized form a class analysis that is consistent with Marxism. The modern day system of corporate rule and exploitation overseen by the wealthy 1% and their servants in the upper fringe of the 99% is what we mean by capitalism. The heart and soul and great majority of the 99% of the working class, and the goal of establishing the democratic control of the 99% over our economic and political life is what we understand by socialism. And I think that this is something that we can take from the movements as very positive to what we're trying to do. But of course, it's not just this analysis that has come out of the movements of the last 18 months or so. There's been an enormous explosion of writing and journalism and theorizing on the nature of the movements, the composition of the movements. Very eclectic, very some of it quite wacky, some of it a lot more serious. And I think that the best distillation of some of these ideas is in a book by Paul Mason, the economics editor of Newsnight on BBC. He's got a book called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. And he puts together a number of different ideas about why it's all kicking off, why is it happening now. And he sees the explanation as being big social changes in the demographics of revolt, in advances in technology, and in how these things have impacted on human behaviour. So what I want to do is really try and have a look at some of the ideas that have come out of it, and also try and look at what the similarities and differences are between this movement and the last movement, which hopefully can help us think about what's going on a little bit more clearly and help us to put together a strategy for how we intervene in the movements. One obvious difference between what's going on now and what happened in 1999 is the scale on which it emerged. If you think back to 1999, Chris Harman wrote at the time, summed up, sometimes the symbolism of events gives them an importance out of all proportion to the numbers of people directly involved in them. So on the 30th of November 1999, the Battle of Seattle, there were about 30,000 people involved in one city. We could see on the 15th of October, when the big day of action that had been called in solidarity with the Indignados movement and Occupy Wall Street, you had over 1.5 million people protesting in 950 cities around the world. And although there were, there were variations in, in Spain alone, about a million people marched, about 100,000 in New York. In Britain, quite a lot smaller, about 3,000, but still quite a significant mobilisation in terms of an anti-capitalist protest. And in all of them, really what you saw was the sense in which the Arab revolutions had really infused the spirit of the protests, and that call of the 99% against the 1%, emanating as it did from, in many ways, the symbolic heart of global capitalism on Wall Street, really did have a seismic effect, and you saw occupation springing up from South Carolina to South Korea. But in all of these protests, what you had was not simply a spontaneous eruption of a movement. In all of them, there had been a process that had built up to them, with people who had been organising against austerity, organising against the crisis, sometimes even before the outbreak of the crisis. You can think about, for example, how key players from Climate Camp were involved in the Occupy protest in London, even if after the 15th of October quite large numbers of new people came to be involved and take ownership of the movement. Indeed, a lot of the movements that we've seen in a lot of the camps, there's a big debate about are are we even anti-capitalist? So you can look at the London Occupy camp, and there, you know, they made a big play of saying, well, no, we're not anti-capitalist. Well, some of us might be anti-capitalist, but that's not what we're here for. They even took down the Capitalism is Crisis banner that they inherited from Climate Camp, and went through a process of putting out various proclamations about how capitalism could be reformed, some of them utopian, some of them just plain awful, to be honest. But there were healthy debates in the occupied Times of London, which showed that it was a contested issue. And in fact, in the Spanish 15th of May movement, the Indignados movement, even though a lot of people involved in them would have seen themselves as anti-capitalists, really the main demand they were known for was real democracy now. But I think that to come to terms with what's going on, we have to be quite clear about the content as well as the form of these protests. And like the post-Seattle movement, I think that we could describe them as being anti-capitalist in the sense that they're anti-systemic. Alex Kalinikos, when he was writing about the movement at the time in the Anti-Capitalist Manifesto, said that you could see them as movements that don't simply campaign over specific grievances, but are motivated by a sense of the interconnection between an immense variety of different injustices and dangers. And so I think that there's a number of similarities and differences that you can see between the campaigns. The one that I think is very important is the way in which the mobilisations operate this time on a very different tempo and in a different terrain. Even though they're guided by a real radical sense of internationalism, a sense that we're all part of a global movement, the tempo of each of these protests has very much been set by confrontations within the nation state itself, with, in confrontations with the police and in confrontations with the government, partly because the attempt to set up permanent camps leads to direct confrontation with the police and the apparatus of the state, and partly because these protest movements are often engaged in life or death battles, in a way, with the policies of the government, the cuts that are being pushed forward, the various austerity practices that are being pushed forward. And so you have this sense in which, unlike the movement after 1999, there's much more a sense of the state being an enemy. After 1999, you had much more of a sense that the state had withered away, and it was global capitalism per se that was the main enemy. Now there's much more a sense of course, there's global capitalism, but the state is the key actor in terms of our confrontation with global capitalism. Another thing I want to sort of talk about is the way in which that even though there's been a rejection of the idea that it's just all about global capitalism as some sort of disembodied force, a lot of the common sense ideas that relate to that, I think, have been internalized by the movements. What do I mean by that? I think it's best summed up by throughout the period of neoliberalism, of Thatcherism, of Reagan, etc., a lot of these ideas, I think, was summed up quite well by a guy called Mark Fisher, who wrote a little book called Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? And he talks about capitalist realism as being the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. And I think that even though the onset of crisis and the rise of the new movements has seen that splinter and has seen that break and has seen the possibility of people imagining different kinds of worlds to capitalism, they really start still from that standpoint. And so a lot of the common sense ideas that came out of neoliberalism, that capitalism has fundamentally changed, that we can understand the world now as being a weightless economy where everything is governed by flows of information, that capital can just up sticks and move from country to country, that was kind of maintained as a starting point for a lot of the ideas. And I think that part of this is expressed through this very dominant metaphor that's used of a network. Now, the theorists of new capitalism very much talk about capitalism is now a network of flows of information, of flows of signs and symbols. Value is created through abstract processes of intellectual and immaterial labour. I think this is summed up best by Manuel Castells in his idea of a network society. But Paul Mason takes up this idea and really says that the flip side to this is that the combined impact of social networks and individualistic self, another real key point of neoliberalism, would facilitate a clear break with old forms of organisation, including parties, unions, and permanent campaigns. And I think that really what the problem you have with this is that it takes the old framework of neoliberalism or capitalist realism and internalises it and tries to make it part of explaining the protest movement today. When really I think that this isn't going to get us very far. Kevin Dugan, who wrote a very good critique of the theories of new capitalism in a book called New Capitalism, says that, for example, whereas discussion of old capitalism might invite consideration of social classes as agencies and the distribution of income as outcomes, new capitalism is a confluence of narratives that captures and represents the world in terms of abstract, self-sustaining social processes. And really he says that what this means is that capitalism and the society around us appears as all motion and no matter. And this, I think, is fundamental to a network society. And to explain it, what Dugan does is uses a metaphor. He says, imagine if there was a similar shift in medicine. It might lead to a new hematology, which is exclusively concerned with the flow of blood around the body, yet remaining wholly uninterested in the heart. Now, I don't know about you, I wouldn't want any surgery done on me by someone who thought that that was the best way of analysing the body, and by the same measure, I think that that's not really the way we want to think about how society is organised. Because the flip side of this is, for example, you can look at how in the camps, in Occupy, for example, there's a big emphasis on talking about process rather than talking about ideology. We don't want to talk about ideologies and all that old stuff. We're talking about new processes. Really what that means is you end up with long periods of time discussing how to make decisions without making any decisions. I think that we need to really ground our ideas about why it is that these new forms of organisation are split up in quite concrete circumstances. So the fall of Stalinism, the rightward drift of social democracy reformism, and the weakness of the revolutionary left over the period of neoliberalism has meant that a lot of new activists coming into radical politics for the first time don't see these old touchstones of radical politics as the first port of call, and in fact there's new common sense forms of organisation that try to get away from the need to have parties in the first place. So on the one hand you have occupations, physical occupations, as a way of not needing to have parties, political organisation. We don't need this because we've got a physical camp. But then you also see this metaphors of the network rolled out as an alternative to organisation. We don't need formal organisations. We can just, loosely organise. We don't need centralised decision making. We can all do our own thing, and that will sort out the problems for us. And Paul Mason talks about this quite a lot in his book, and he has this thing that he keeps coming back to, which is the network beats the hierarchy. But in his discussion of, for example, the British movement, the Egyptian movement, I think there's a real problem, because Paul Mason repeatedly refers to individuals who are members of organisations, acting as members of organisations, just doesn't mention that they're members of organisations. They're just part of networks in this. And also, if you look at his discussion, for example, of the protests after the student movement, the occupation of Millbank, the protests that happened afterwards, there's this entire discussion without once mentioning the Education Activist Network, the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, which were crucial to not only calling the days of action that followed the siege of Millbank, but also having a national coordination. Another way that he does this is in his discussion of UK Uncut. You know, you have really UK Uncut is a tweet that goes out, there's one protest, and then all of a sudden there's 15 protests, and then all of a sudden there's dozens and dozens and dozens of protests. What's airbrushed out of this discussion is the way in which various parties and organisations played a key role in spreading the movements. For example, you know, the SWP, Right to Work, called on all of its supporters and members after the first protest, which we were on, by the way, to go out and set up these campaigns. Now, this isn't to play down the ingenuity and the importance of UK Uncut, absolutely not. Nor is it to say that social media didn't play an important role, but by focusing only on those things at the expense of really looking at what were the real social processes and social forces that built these movements, it really doesn't get us any closer to understanding why they were able to take off. And in fact, Paul Mason leaves us with quite a, I think, quite a bleak view of the movement in Britain, because he says that really the horizontalist movement is left with a crisis of direction that it's struggling to recover from, because there's a problem which youthful, socially networked horizontalist movements would have everywhere when things got serious: the absence of strategy. Now, a year before Paul Mason published this book, I wrote an article on social media and social movements, where I said that this was when this problem would occur, because Paul Mason, in an article that he wrote a year ago, said that ideas arise and are quickly market tested and then either take off, bubble under, insinuate themselves into mainstream culture, or if they are no good, disappear. And what I said at the time was, you know, what does it mean to be good? What is it? How do we define whether or not something is good? You know, a lot of things are good, but don't really play much of a role in bringing down capitalism. A lot of things are really boring and really awful and routine. You know, I can't imagine that someone would send out a tweet saying, "Hey guys, let's go and do a paper sale at the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning." People say, "Yeah, this is a brilliant idea, I'm going to do that." But this kind of points us to the problem. If things that are very rewarding in the short term are taken up at the expense of strategic thinking in the long term, then you can have some real problems. I think there's a way of getting over this and getting around this, and that's really where I want to end. Because I think that if we're talking about networks and you know, decentralized forms of politics as an alternative to organisation, then I think that we're going up a blind alley, because networks aren't alternatives to networks. Sorry, to organisations. In fact, a network is, as one article puts it, just an analytical device that sociologists and computer scientists use to understand relations between actors. Networks may contain organisations, organisations may contain networks, both formal and hierarchical and informal and non-hierarchical, as well as everything in between. What does this really mean? Well, any group of people is a network. And really, when we talk about networks, we're not talking about something physical, we're talking about a way of describing groups of people. And I think that if we move away from that false dichotomy, then we can start to think much more productively about forms of organisation that are at the same time able to resolve strategic and tactical questions and get away from problems of hierarchy. Because I think that when we talk about revolutionary organisation, revolutionary parties, you have to really, in one way, conceive of it as a network, but one that's centralised in order to develop its ideas. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, by having a centralised and democratic organisation, then you're able to put decision-making into the hands of the majority rather than into the hands of a very small number of people who are able to make decisions on the basis of having the time and the energy, the skills, the eloquence, if you like, to be involved in very long periods of process decision making. This is something that is summed up very well by someone called Joe Freeman in an article from the late 60s, early 70s, I forget, called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And really what we want from a revolutionary organisation is a democratic organisation in which a network of revolutionaries, which are in turn part of other networks such as activists, rank and file movements, student movements, and all the rest of it. And it's that cross-cutting nature of political activity that allows members of a revolutionary organisation to understand the levels of unevenness in consciousness amongst workers and other activists, because they're able to learn from the most advanced layers of the class with whom they're in constant dialogue in campaigns, in building a workplace organisation, but they're also able to gain an understanding of the less politically conscious layers of the class through the people that they work alongside. And this network of activists in the class is then able to feed that experience back to a democratic forum that's able to centralise these ideas and use this outlook over the class as a whole in order to attempt to formulate strategic outlooks and implement tactical decisions. And in order for this to work, it has to be democratic. There has to be the maximum level of debate and discussion in order to thrash out the way forward, and then unity in putting it into practice so we can work out whether or not it was right or wrong in order to be able to correct or advance these ideas. And this has to be a two-way relationship. There needs to be deep political trust within the organisation amongst the activists, but also deep political trust between those activists and the people that they're engaged in different campaigns in their workplaces that they're seeking to both influence and learn from. Because socialist organisation historically has taken a number of forms, but in order to be effective against capitalism, it's always had to be made up of a well-rooted network of revolutionaries who are at the heart of the struggle. And winning this argument in the wider movement, I think, is going to be something that will mean a lot of patient explanation, a lot of working alongside people, but where I want to end is what really can strengthen the importance and the understanding of the importance of this kind of movement is really the return of working class struggle to the stage of history. And the wave of general strikes that we've seen across Europe and the beginnings, the rumblings of the working class movement in Britain, you know, advancing, retreating, going forward, going back, as it is, starts, I think, to within layers of people who have now seen the camps dismantled, have seen the might of the state used against them, starts a process of questioning and attempts to understand. And by working alongside these people and by constantly trying to link them up with the power of the organised working class, I think we're able to think much more creatively about how we can start to build a real revolutionary spine in the heart of all those people who are now looking for an alternative to capitalism. Anything in the Occupy movement that I think is an advance on our politics. I mean, I think the key thing is that on the one hand you have that almost, you know, that seemed almost an elemental explosion of anger, but I think the real legacy of it is that sense of them and us that came out of the Occupy movement, which I hope I stressed throughout my talk as being an absolutely crucial and critical advance for those of us who are trying to change the world. And I think that the way in which that argument operates, you know, who are the 99%? We are the 99%. You are the 99%. You know, come and join us. I think is a very important thing. I'm afraid I don't have time to talk about Egypt. I think that's a whole other meeting. But so I want to try and focus on the questions that I had about this. I think that, you know, the role of reformism this time and last time, I think it's important to bear in mind. Let's not look at the old anti-capitalist movement with rose-tinted glasses. Reformism was a big part of the old anti-capitalist movement. Reformists of varying degrees of radicalism, from the Attack organization in France, you have Rifondazione Comunista, you had various reformist organizations who were involved in it. And also, it's interesting to read Chris Harman on the development of the anti-capitalist movement, the way in which, in the absence of a coherent political alternative, the way that even some of the most radical kind of autonomous elements of the movement flipped into a support for reformist elements. So in France, for example, the way in which even people like José Bové fell into a big figure in the anti-capitalist movement, flipped into supporting the Socialist Party in presidential elections. So I do think that there is that. And also, I tell you what, if you think that Occupy Wall Street are hostile to political organisation, you didn't see nothing if you weren't at the social forums and whatnot, where the level of hostility towards political organisation was incredibly sharp. My own experience of Occupy, and I spent a lot of time at the with the Occupy St. Paul's camp, was that they were far more open to political organisation, and also far more open to the involvement of trade unionists, getting trade unionists down there. We organised trade union days where trade unionists could come down with their banners. I think it was taken to an even higher level in America, in places like Wall Street and Oakland that people have already mentioned, where organised labour played quite an important role in the organisation. In the organisation of it, but I do think that that in that sense, Occupy, I think, is in a lot of ways a big step forward in that sense. And to what extent is anarchism a guiding part? I think that in a lot of senses, anarchism, or a loose sense of autonomism, I think is a common sense idea for a lot of people. Why is that? Well, partly because when you first go onto the streets and you're making the running, and everything you're doing seems to unbalance the system, then, someone turns around and say, hey, we need an organisation. You can turn around and say, well, why do we need an organisation? We seem to be doing pretty well without one. It's really when you come up against obstacles that you have to stop and start rethinking that. And I think that at the moment, a lot of people are engaged in that process of trying to rethink what is what they need to do, what is going on, and I think the future of Occupy is all up in the air. But I think that the spirit that informs Occupy, that spirit of us versus them, is something that has very much informed, for example, the success that Syriza has had in Greece, that has informed the campaign of Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, it informs the continuing mobilisations against austerity. I think that is something that is here to stay, and I think that is something that we all have to be really optimistic about, whether or not the camps are still there or not. And finally, do I recommend Paul Mason's book? I think people should read Paul Mason's book if they're interested in this side of things, because actually it does crystallise a lot of those common sense ideas that have come out of the movement. I think that by and large they're wrong. I think that by and large there's a huge amount of technological determinism in there. The technology solves our problems. I think that the discussion of how about how human behaviour has changed because of technology is pop psychology and pop sociology at best. But the other thing is that when you read it, it does give you a real sense of how exciting the last 18 months or so have been. I think it's very good journalism, if not very good analysis. So, I would read the book, but I wouldn't leave that as the end point of your analysis, because I think that one of the conclusions that we can bring out of that, and out of all of the events of the past 18 months, is that organisation does matter, and that building lasting organisation that is able to formulate strategic plans but also to implement tactical decisions is incredibly important. And it's for that reason that I think that even though everything that's gone on has been incredibly exciting, that we need to also maintain at the heart of everything we're doing the importance of building revolutionary organisation that can bring in the widest layers of people into the process, but also relate to the widest layers of people, influence the widest layers of people in order to take all of the movements forward.